And I just want to say thank you for attending the 2021 Environmental Lecture Series hosted by Lake Johnson Park. I am Susan Jones, and if you guys have any questions, feel free to let me know. Tonight's lecture will be Fire in North Carolina, a Natural and Human History, given by Laurel Keyes, an NC State University Extension Forestry person. So just a quick reminder, this lecture is being recorded, so if you don't want to be recorded, please turn off your camera. Feel free to use the chat box during the lecture if you have any questions. There will be time for Q&A at the end of the lecture. So again, I will be trying to monitor the chat and help get to any questions to Laurel, and I will pass it on over to Laurel. Thank you, Laurel, for coming tonight.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for having me. Let me know if anything is weird with the screen sharing or sound, but otherwise I will assume that we're doing fine. So I'm going to talk a little bit about fire in North Carolina, about the history of that on the landscape and how that relates to the people living on that landscape. And first, I just want to talk very, very briefly a little bit about what I do. So I work out of NC State Extension Forestry, like Susan mentioned, and I work on a couple different projects related to improving the way we manage fire on the landscape across the South, including, of course, North Carolina. So this will become clearer in a little bit, but in North Carolina, in the South, most of that is centered around increasing the use of safe and effective prescribed fire. But it also includes quite a few other things. And I work with a lot of different organizations, including a group called the Southern Fire Exchange, which is a science communication organization that gets folks doing fire management, scientific information in an accessible way. I also am the vice president of the North Carolina Prescribed Fire Council, which is a group of all of the folks in the state working on fire, where we can work together and work on a bunch of different projects. And so just very quickly, because I know some of you, I think, are environmental ed folks on the line, want to say that all of those groups and others that I'm involved with do a whole lot of different things, including training and assistance for people who own land and may want to manage that land in any variety of ways, public outreach and education like this, professional development and science communication for any number of types of folks, and helping people work together to accomplish some of the land management and forest management and fire stuff that can be hard to do alone by a single entity or a single landowner. Excuse me. So if any of that sounds like something that would be helpful to you related to forest management or fire or anything like that, my email's at the end of this. Please feel free to get in touch. If I can't help you out, I can certainly connect you with someone who can. So in terms of today, I'm going to just give a tiny bit of background and then get into the meat of things, talking about what fire looked like in North America before European colonization, the impact of that colonization, the rise of the kind of conservation movement and this Smokey Bear fire suppression era that we're still kind of living in the aftermath of, and then what fire looks like in North Carolina here in the 21st century, what that looks like in the future, and then a quick appendix about kind of what's going on out west that we see in the news so often lately and how that relates to us out here. And all of that, after that, I have just a couple quick slides of places to read or listen to more information if that's something that you're interested in. So just very quickly, I'd love for everyone to take a quick second while I'm on this slide to just kind of think of what things spring to your mind or your emotions when you think about fire. Kind of the through line of this whole talk is that the way we use fire on the landscape, the way that we relate to it and see its relationship to us as humans is changeable. And so just kind of think about what you think of when you think of fire, whether that's positive, negative, all of those sort of things, and kind of keep that in mind as we're talking about the way that that has changed over time throughout this talk. Also, these are just the only definitions that we're going to need, but just very quickly, if I'm talking about kind of fire on the landscape generally, or use the term wildland fire, all that means is any fire that's in a non-vegetative, or is in a rather vegetation or natural fuels. So it's any fire out on the landscape. We're not talking about fires in buildings for which we call 911 and the structural fire department shows up. Within that, there's sort of two broad types of fire, and these are just kind of our human definitions. They don't necessarily relate to how the fire is burning or the flame size or anything like that. These are just kind of legally how we define different types of fire. So there's wildfire, which I'm sure a lot of you won't be surprised to find out, just means that is a fire originating from an unplanned ignition, something like a lightning bolt, something like an human accident. So someone's out burning their trash and it gets out, or someone's car sparks on the side of the highway, or arson that is, of course, on purpose. And then we have prescribed fire, which is a type of wildland fire, which is planned, done in accordance with laws, policies, regulations to meet specific objectives for a specific purpose. And that can look really different depending on who's doing it, but very broadly, that's what those two terms are going to mean. We'll come back to all of this at the end, but just very quickly here in North Carolina, we do have quite a few wildfires. The eastern United States actually sees many more wildfires than the western United States by number, but they are typically small. Here in North Carolina, our wildfire season is actually fall and spring, not in the summer when a lot of times you're hearing about fire because it's the western fire season. And we use prescribed fire really widely as a land management tool for a lot of reasons: to reduce fuels that increase the risk of catastrophic wildfire, to keep our forests and our ecosystems healthy and to oftentimes restore those ecosystems, to protect people who are living on the edges of or within natural areas, and for a lot of other reasons that we'll talk about more at the end. So what I want to show you here just really quickly as I'm talking throughout all of this and talking about sort of some of the effects of using fire versus not using fire, to sort of keep this image in mind. So these are not from the same site, but they're both from Durham County. The one on the left is at NC State's Hill Forest. It was a burn that we did a couple weeks back. And this stand hasn't been burned in more than a decade, probably quite a bit more than that. And so you can see there's a lot of very small trees, a lot of shrubby stuff. You can't see it very well in this picture, but there's quite a lot of vines, and there is not a lot of stuff growing on the forest floor. So those are all pretty characteristic of North Carolina forests where fire has been excluded. On the right, I think this is a North Carolina Botanical Garden site. This is a site that has, in, again, the same county, the same general area that is managed with fire. So you can see this has sort of relatively fewer but larger trees that are more widely spaced. It has a lot of stuff growing up in the understory and not a lot of stuff in that kind of middle zone, shrubby, very small tree type of vegetation. So while these are in the Piedmont, and we're going to talk a lot about the coastal plain and the Piedmont as well, just kind of keep this in mind when we're talking about what a place looks like when it is versus isn't managed with fire. This is sort of the general characteristics that we're talking about. And North Carolina and the broader, what we now call the United States, is very fire adapted. Most of our ecosystems have some sort of natural interval at which they experience fire. And you can see in North Carolina, in most of our state, that's very often. Most of our ecosystems are adapted to fire every 10 years or less. And particularly in the coastal plain, as you get down to what we'll talk about in a second, is longleaf pine territory. Those forests are adapted to fire every 1 to 3 years, so very frequently. And this is also a place that is created from native people's land. These people were, of course, the first stewards of, the first residents of this land. And that's important to keep in mind, and we're going to talk more about that in just a minute, but I just want to draw attention to it. I'm sure a lot of you have also seen this map, the native-land.ca. It's a really good kind of beginning place to look at the original inhabitants of a place that you live or work, and then try and kind of take some next steps from there, depending on the sort of work or the sort of life that you have. To the best of my understanding, Lake Johnson was created, because of course it was a man-made lake, on ancestral Tuscarora and Lumbee lands, according to this map at least. So we're going to talk a little bit about what North America looked like in terms of fire and in terms of sort of the broader landscape before Europeans like my ancestors showed up. And it's important to start with and remember that a lot of us, myself certainly included, were taught to think about this from a very flawed foundation. A lot of us were taught what is a lot of times called the myth of the pristine. So this is the idea that before Europeans showed up, North America was sort of this big, pristine, untouched wilderness area, kind of like Yellowstone National Park on steroids, with a couple small groups of people moving through or a couple little villages and that kind of thing. When in reality, North Carolina alone was inhabited for roughly 12,000 years before Europeans showed up. Other parts of North America were inhabited for much longer. And Native people, when we're talking about Native people, we're talking about an incredibly diverse group of folks, people who had different nations and languages, different cultures, different religious beliefs. But in talking about all of those diverse people together, they did all use and manage land for a lot of the same reasons we do today. And they did manage land. There were large populations of people. They left quite significant marks on the landscape. This was not sort of some untouched wilderness. It was the home to many, many, many people. And these people used fire very intentionally as a land management tool, and for a lot of similar reasons to what we do today. And again, this is talking about a very diverse group of people, but talking at a very high level. This would have varied a lot depending on where the specific nation or community was and their kind of goals for what they were trying to do. But speaking very broadly, Native people used fire for hunting, both to create habitat that their preferred hunting species would like, and also to create habitat that provided other resources they need. They also would have used it for actual doing the hunting, so for driving prey species into areas where they could be more efficiently slaughtered. They used it to clear land for agriculture, to reduce the risk of wildfire, for warfare, to set fires on an opposing tribe, to communicate with each other, and to make areas easier to travel through. And we'll talk about the travel piece in a minute a little bit more later. But kind of what I mean by that is if you think back to those pictures I showed previously and to the ones on this slide in the lower piece, areas that are managed with fire that have less of that shrubby stuff growing up, that have more of a couple larger trees, more widely spaced, that's going to be a lot easier for you to travel through as opposed to a fire excluded land, which has a lot of shrubby stuff, viney stuff that can be hard to get through. Lightning also, of course, ignited fires, and when it did, those fires were able to burn over a much larger landscape. We didn't have, roads and concrete structures and lawns and all of that sort of stuff breaking up the landscape like we do today. So when lightning did ignite a fire, or when humans ignited fires, they were able to burn over much larger landscapes. And the combined use of fire by Native people as well as by lightning means that we ended up with ecosystems, particularly in the eastern part of our state, but the western part too, that need fire to remain healthy. They aren't only adapted to fire, but they, in many cases, require it on a relatively frequent scale in order to stay healthy. And I'll pause for just 1 second. It's hard for me to see the chat, but if we have any questions, I'll just pause for 1 second. I didn't see any, but I'll double check. All right, we're good. And you can put questions in the chat. I should have mentioned this earlier. As I go on, I'll try and pause and check it periodically, but we can also do questions at the end. So when Europeans did arrive into what we now call the United States, they would have found a place that looks quite a bit different than it does today, of course. So these pictures, the one on the top left is from the coastal plain. That's a longleaf pine forest. That's the sort of forest I was talking about that experiences fire every 1 to 3 years. The forest on the upper right is a mixed pine hardwood forest in the Piedmont, sort of more similar to those pictures I was showing from Durham County earlier. And the one on the bottom is a very famous picture of some men standing with some very large old growth American chestnuts in the mountains. And today I am gonna, since we otherwise would be at Lake Johnson, I am gonna be talking mostly about the Piedmont and coastal plain of North Carolina. So I'm gonna be talking less about the mountains hereafter, but the mountains also are fire adapted. They have a slightly different history. So here we're gonna sort of shift and focus more on the Piedmont and the coastal plain. And not only would the forests themselves have looked quite a bit different when Europeans got here, but a lot of the areas that now are forests would not necessarily have been. So there were extensive grasslands across the South, including in North Carolina. This is a map drawn in 1718 by a European with, you can see the words Grand Savan in the Carolina Piedmont, pretty much just north of where we are today, depending on kind of how you view where this map was talking about. But we don't see large savannas like that anymore, in large part because of fire suppression, as well as because those areas without trees would have been really easy to be tilled up for agriculture to develop on. But a lot of areas that we now see as forests actually would have been maintained as grassland as a result of the frequent fire that was happening. But eventually, as European colonizers do arrive, large-scale changes happen on the landscape very, very quickly. So you can see that top picture is showing the rough area of forest that was cleared between 1620, so roughly some of the first Europeans coming over, to 1850, when their populations were quite a bit larger. And this time period would have been before a lot of the industrial advances that allowed forests to be harvested quicker, to be harvested from more remote areas. You can see a lot of the mountains in that second picture still remain. But it didn't take very long for land and forests to start to be cleared quite a bit. The picture in the lower left is showing us close-up of the smallpox virus. That was one of the diseases which most drastically impacted Native people, really decimated their populations because they did not have natural or have developed immunity like Europeans did. And of course, Native people were also forcibly removed from their lands through violence by the emerging United States government. European colonizers also brought species like hogs to use as livestock, and they would just sort of let them run loose and eat nuts and stuff wherever they were running. And those hogs still are today, causing quite a bit of changes out on the landscape where they're allowed to run free and reproduce, which they do quite quickly and in quite large numbers. A lot of area was cleared for agriculture, and the type of agriculture that was done was very intensive. Products like cotton, which really depleted topsoil very quickly, which would have been a lot more intensive than some of the crops that would have been grown by Native people before the Europeans. And all of this resulted in just really wide-scale forest clearing and other changes out on the landscape. We should also note too, particularly with the decrease in Native populations, that as Europeans spread into some of these previously more remote areas into the West, that a lot of these people were describing forests that even before Europeans got there in large numbers had already been changed quite a bit, because disease epidemics had so impacted Native people. A lot of forests that are sort of described as these like dark, primeval, idyllic sort of forests by some early European writers were actually evidence of the fact that Native populations had been decreased and they were no longer able to do things like burn on the landscape to the extent that they had been before. And so forests were kind of growing up in the legacy of that hadn't necessarily been there historically. And as European populations started to grow, they also increased the pace with which they were exploiting the resources that they were finding in North Carolina and across the South. So this picture right there is showing you the historic range of longleaf pine. It comes right up into part of Wake County, kind of the southern part of Wake County. And longleaf pine, in addition to other forest types that were farther to the west, were heavily exploited for a lot of different reasons, but particularly for the naval stores industry. And naval stores were products like pitch and tar that were really essential to shipbuilding. And these were, I'll show you in the next slide, created from longleaf pine sap, which once that sap was depleted from trees, those trees were cut down and on to the next. And I also want to point out that when we're talking about all of this, what we're talking about is not forest management or forestry like we talk about today. The way we do forestry now involves a lot of scientific basis and most importantly involves planning. So it's folks who have scientific knowledge of how trees grow, of how soils and weather and all of the, and fire and all of these other things kind of influence the different ways that ecosystems and forests can grow. And so we may cut down trees sometimes, but it's all with a plan for the future. There's a plan to reforest. There's a plan to regrow. That's not what this was. This was just going and, kind of cutting things down willy-nilly and moving on as soon as there wasn't money to be made. And this was done in large part because the Europeans who came to North America, saw this absolutely huge, expansive continent that had forests and resources, the size of which they just really boggled their minds. It genuinely did not occur to them that they could ever exhaust these resources, even though, as we'll see, it turns out, very possible. And so this is some photos showing you some of what the naval stores industry would have looked like. So that photo on the right is a longleaf with what we call a cat face. And that cat face is a really good example of how some of that sap that was used for the naval stores industry would have been collected. So this tree would have been alive at the time, of course. They would have put those scratches in. There would have been a little bucket sitting in that niche at the bottom to collect the sap that came out as a result of those scratches. And they would have kept doing that, making more fresh scratches, getting more sap until the tree was pretty much depleted. And then in most cases, the tree would be cut down and used for timber. Of course, this one clearly wasn't. And again, a lot of the folks who were doing this very hard labor, which was often in really remote areas, a lot of them lived in kind of encampments in the woods, essentially. A lot of those folks would have been slaves or very low income white folks who didn't have a lot of other options for income and for a living. And this stuff that was happening in the longleaf range of the South was kind of mirrored all across all across North Carolina and all across North America. It wasn't necessarily the naval stores industry everywhere, but across the country, across the continent, resources were really just being exploited, used to make money and to build things as quickly as possible without really a thought for the future. Wood was a really essential resource at the time. We're talking about kind of the late 1700s, but mostly during the 1800s. This is a time period where most people are using wood to heat their home, to do their cooking, and of course to build a lot of different things, including their homes. Railroads and other industrial advances as a result of the burgeoning Industrial Revolution not only created more demand for timber to actually build the railroads, but also created a greater ability to get into previously too remote areas to actually harvest that timber and move on. And this was often done to benefit wealthy timber barons who were given or leased large, huge scales of land by the burgeoning US government and basically allowed to cut down everything and move on. But throughout all of this, unlike in a lot of other places, people were still using fire as a management tool in the Southeast. Again, we're talking mostly the coastal plain and Piedmont here in North Carolina. And this happened for a lot of different reasons. A couple of them being that the immigrants, the European colonizers rather, that settled into North Carolina were largely people who came from places like rural Western England, later Scotland and Ireland. These were places where rangelands, large rangelands, were already managed using fire. And so the Europeans who arrived would have seen Native people using fire as a tool, and it's something that would have made a lot of cultural sense to them. This picture, or these images, I'm not sure how big it is on your screen. I think some of them are pretty small, but they also show just sort of how quickly fire suppression in North Carolina ecosystems creates really big changes that would have been unfavorable to the European colonists. So it wouldn't have taken very long for them to see that when you stop burning, forests grow up really quickly. The shrubs grow up, they're harder to move through. They are more of a risk when things dry out in terms of wildfires. And so not only did they understand that fire was a tool you can use on the landscape, but they would have seen very quickly why it was a tool that was needed here. And so all of this sort of continues the resource exploitation across the nation, the continued use of fire by Southern people as a land management tool, all the way in through the 1800s into the early 1900s. And as those early 1900s rolls around, a lot of things are changing. This was the time when people were, or rather the government was, and the powers that be, were realizing that our natural resources actually do have a limit. There is a finite amount of forests, there is a finite amount of ecosystems, and if we cut all the forests down, if we degrade all the ecosystems, we can't necessarily get that back. And this was, kind of, again, the rise of this like conservation ethic of the early progressive era. These were when very famous people like John Muir and Aldo Leopold and Gifford Pinchot, who's sort of less known now, but was at the time very well known. He was the first chief of the US Forest Service. And these people were speaking and writing very publicly about the need to do something about what was happening to our resources, to set some of them aside to not be used for profit, to set some of them aside for recreation for future generations, to actually need to steward our natural resources. This was also the time when forestry as a profession was just starting to emerge in the United States, or at least forestry as we practice it now. I think what Native people did isn't necessarily called forestry. It's often referred to as traditional ecological knowledge. It has some differences, but obviously is managing forests. But the rise of what we now call forestry was just starting. The first foresters that practiced in the United States, and the cradle of forestry in the United States, the first forest school, is in Western North Carolina. So even though we're not so much talking about the western part of the state, that is an important claim to fame that we have. But those foresters were largely trained in places like Germany. They came over here and they started teaching other people what they had been taught. This was also the time when public land management agencies were first started, so things like the Forest Service and the National Park Service. And a lot of those changes led to the very intense era of fire suppression that, again, we're still sort of living with the ramifications of today. And that fire suppression came about because of a lot of reasons, some more and some less kind of understandable looking back. The first of those was sort of this perception of fire that I was talking about at the beginning. People culturally, in general, just kind of saw fire as a force to be tamed, not a tool to be used. This was also further enhanced by some really quite catastrophic, very deadly wildfires that happened. That top image is a painting based on the Peshtigo fire, which is actually the deadliest wildfire in US history that took place in northern Wisconsin in 1871, killed at least 1,200 people, potentially more. That lower image is the town of Wallace, which was essentially destroyed by a fire sometimes called the Big Blow Up or the Great Fire of 1910 that burned, I think, about 3 million acres out in the western US and up into British Columbia. And these weren't the only ones. There were, for a lot of different reasons, including the fact that a lot of cutover forests had just kind of been left behind. There were a lot of these very large catastrophic wildfires that really scared people. The new emerging profession of forestry, again, had its roots in Germany. German ecosystems are very different than ours. I don't know if this is still true today, but at least at the time, Germany did not use fire as a management tool. So those foresters would have been taught, much like the sort of larger public idea, that fire was bad. It's something we need to tame and tamp out when we don't want it. It's not something we intentionally put out there. There was also definitely some influence of things like racism and disregard for the cultural knowledge of people who were not seen as able to know what they were talking about. Using what we would now call prescribed fire was sometimes referred to as Indian burning, things like that. There was a strong association with Native people because they used fire as a management tool, and that would not have been seen as a positive thing by a lot of people. There were also definitely disregard for the cultural knowledge of fire held by non-Native people too. Again, those people in the South European descendants who were using fire were also very much looked down on. And so this led to some efforts to some really active and in many ways successful efforts to end the use of fire as a tool in the South. And again, I want to make clear that there were some understandable, valid reasons that people were concerned, particularly those large catastrophic wildfires and just the fear that that inspired and this new drive to take better care of our ecosystems. They were wrong, but some of that is understandable. But again, there were some political motivations, cultural biases, and all of this led to really active efforts to stop the use of fire. Federal funds were withheld from states that allowed burning to be used. These images are from a group called the Dixie Crusaders. They were basically sent around the South, including North Carolina, in the late 1920s, and they were a propaganda campaign. They had films like this one you can see on the left that says Burnin' Bill, and pamphlets and all sorts of things meant to portray people who were using fire as dangerous, as stupid, and to kind of turn the public consciousness against those folks and against using fire. There were also some studies done by sort of early social psychologists, including one by Dr. John Shea that was conducted in the mountains of northern Alabama, that basically were talking to people who were using fire and trying to figure out what was mentally wrong with them, essentially, because that was the assumption, and why they were doing this against kind of all of the best wisdom of what they quote unquote should be doing. And of course, then came Smokey Bear, which is probably one of the most successful public relations or propaganda campaigns of all time, at least in the United States, to kind of follow up on all of these active efforts to end the use of fire, to put out wildfires as soon as they start. Smokey is in many ways a symptom of this idea. He didn't come around until World War II era, when this idea of fire suppression and the actions to implement fire suppression were really already starting to take place, but he definitely made it more popular. He was started as a World War II era propaganda campaign because there was a lot of fear by the government that the Axis powers, particularly Japan, would use wildfires, would start wildfires as a way to distract the US war effort, to take resources and people away from the war effort, and to destroy timber that was very much needed for the war effort at the time. But this all sort of starts to shift and starts to take us more towards where we are now in terms of how we see fire, with this guy here who is named Herbert Stoddard. And Herbert Stoddard was asked to investigate some questions that were arising surrounding quail. So after the Civil War, a lot of very wealthy Northerners came to the South. They bought up former plantations whose owners could no longer afford them because slavery was no longer legal, and they used them as hunting places. And they also brought with them their Northern ideas about fire, namely that it is not a thing that we use. And so this resulted in decrease in populations. They didn't know this was why at the time, but the lack of fire resulted in the decrease of populations of important hunting species, namely quail. And so these people were quite wealthy, they were quite powerful. And so they were able to get the US government, the precursor to the US Fish and Wildlife Service actually, to start doing some studies looking at what is happening to all of the quail. Herbert Stoddard was the person who was leading those studies, who was doing them. And his kind of seminal groundbreaking work of wildlife literature, which is the bobwhite quail, its habitat preservation and increase, really pretty conclusively said the problem is that we don't use fire. This was very contested at the time. It definitely went against, essentially all of the conventional wisdom, all of the scientific establishment at the time. But further studies looked at this again, and the science started to turn pretty conclusively against this idea of fire suppression, at least in southern ecosystems in the Piedmont and particularly coastal plain, and began to pretty conclusively show that no, we actually need fire to keep those ecosystems healthy, especially if we want substantial populations of species we care about, like quail. And so this eventually slowly led to the growing acceptance of using fire as a tool, particularly in the coastal plain and lower Piedmont, Again, those were, the longleaf pine territory, places where ecosystems are adapted to extremely frequent fire, where the science most conclusively early on started to show that you cannot have these ecosystems healthy without fire. And there is now a growing and well-established understanding, especially in North Carolina and the broader South, that prescribed burning is a critical tool that we cannot do without, that is key to achieving a lot of different land management objectives. So I'll pause for a second. Again, I don't think I saw any questions, but if you have any, please feel free to put them in the chat. And so all of that brought us to where we are today, which is a place where we use, again, prescribed fire as a land management tool for a wide variety of purposes. The Southeast uses more prescribed fire than any other region. You can see here in North Carolina, we do quite a bit, and we're trying to do more every year. It's used by professionals like me who do fire as part of their job. It's used by landowners. It's used by contractors who, as part of their work, are hired by landowners and other people to come on and burn their property. We also do still have wildfires. Again, fall and spring are our most active fire seasons. There's a lot of challenges to managing wildfires here in the East. I won't get too deep into that, but really critically, we do still have wildfires, but we have, because we started accepting prescribed fire or re-accepting prescribed fire relatively earlier than a lot of other parts of the United States, we have a really good scientific base of evidence showing us that if you want to decrease the risk of wildfires, particularly large, catastrophic, expensive, dangerous wildfires in the Southeast, in North Carolina, use prescribed fire. It is by far the best, and in many cases, the most cost-effective tool we have to reduce the risk of catastrophic wildfires. I'll just mention very quickly, in case any of you are people who own land or work on land which your organization manages, that if you want to learn more about fire, the North Carolina Forest Service is a great first call. You can call me, you can give me an email to learn more and to learn what the steps would be to do that. So for the last couple minutes, I want to talk a little bit about what the future of fire in North Carolina looks like, and how that's going to change as our climate continues to change and continues to change a lot of the ways that we are able to do things now. So there's four kind of major points that we already see happening, and we know are going to continue to happen with respect to fire and climate change in North Carolina and the broader South. The first is that prescribed fire is becoming and is going to keep becoming more difficult. What we call burn windows, which is just kind of the weather during which it is usually, for most places, good for burning, safe for burning, are going to become less frequent, especially in the summer months. We are going to see, and are already seeing, these boom and bust cycles of a lot of rain or other kinds of precipitation, and then drought in between those large rain events. This is not great for prescribed fire, because in a lot of places we want areas to be wet enough so the fire isn't going to move too fast or burn too intensely, but dry enough so our fuels are going to burn. That middle ground is a lot harder to get when you have these cycles of a lot of rain and then dry. There's also a lot of questions about how species ranges are shifting. If you are managing a place that's kind of on the edge of what used to be longleaf territory, is it going to become better for longleaf? How are these ecosystems going to shift and move as the climate continues to move? We don't have a lot of great answers for that. We know that wildfires are becoming more frequent. They're going to burn more area. Our fire seasons are lengthening because of weather changes. Prescribed fire being more difficult means there is less wildfire risk reduction. Of course, there's a greater risk of wildfire during droughts. And as those boom and bust cycles of precipitation and drought increasingly become the norm, droughts and rising wildfire risk are also going to become more frequent. There is the complicating factor of the fact that most is an understatement. It's something like 99, 95% of wildfires in the South are human caused. So there's a lot of questions about, will human behavior change? If so, how will it change, and how will that affect the wildfires we see? We know that impacts will disproportionately and are disproportionately impacting already vulnerable populations, like people who have less money, like racial minorities, particularly Black and Indigenous people. The southern US has exceptionally high, in studies, socioeconomic vulnerability to wildfire. So what that means is places where there's a lot of vulnerable populations and a high risk of wildfire. There have been other studies that have shown things like wildfire spreading faster on heirs property, which is a type of property ownership that in eastern North Carolina, the coastal plain of the South, is most common within Black families for a variety of historical reasons. We already see natural disasters, including wildfires, disproportionately impact low-income and minority people. That's going to continue to be the case unless we take action to change that. And we also know there are a lot of complicating factors here. How are hurricanes going to factor in? How is that precipitation going to factor in? Hurricanes can be really problematic when they blow down a lot of trees, like happened in Hurricane Michael a couple years ago. It can be really hard to get prescribed fire back into those stands when you have a lot of large trees blown down within them. What kind of funding and resources are going to come down the pipe? How are human populations and development going to change? One of the big problems that we see with wildfires and with getting prescribed fire done is that we don't necessarily plan the development of our dwellings, of our cities, of our residential areas with the understanding that fire is going to happen and we need to plan for it. How are Western wildfires going to impact this? Not to get too deep in the weeds, but a lot of the professional people that do prescribe fire are the same people that are getting called up to go out to the Western US and respond to wildfires. As those Western wildfire seasons expand, how is that going to affect the workforce we have to do prescribed fire here? And how, of course, the biggest question is, how is human behavior going to change? What are we going to do about all of this? What are we going to do about all of this, and how is that going to impact what's happening? And so really quickly with our last couple minutes, I just want to talk very briefly about what's going on out west. Fire is so in the news lately. And so I just want to sort of address a couple big questions that often come up when we're talking about fire in North Carolina related to what's going on out in the western part of the country. So what is going on out west? First of all, the West is a really huge place. California alone could fit North Carolina in it 3 times over, and that's just California. So we're talking about a huge place, and we're talking about a lot of different ecosystems and different places with different problems. So there are places like Nevada, for example, or parts of Southern California, where fire is much less a part of the ecosystem there, where the problem there is that fire is actually burning too much because of invasive species and human actions. And the problem there is we need less fire on the landscape, not more. And those are places where prescribed fire and a lot of this conversation about fuel treatments and forest management is, in some ways less applicable. But then there are other places like Northern California, parts of Oregon, a lot of other places where they do need to restore fire's place on the landscape, where the lack of prescribed fire history is a much bigger piece of the puzzle. So there's a lot of stuff going on, but in general, fire and fire seasons are a natural part of many ecosystems, but the fires that are burning are larger, more intense than they historically have been. Fire seasons are lengthening, so fires are often burning for longer parts of the year, but the reasons for that vary by location. There's a lot of media coverage of whether the problem here is forest management or climate change, and those are not trade-offs. The answer is that both are the problem. Without doing a whole other presentation about the history of fire in the Western United States, our history of forest management there and forest mismanagement built this tinderbox, as well as human actions and building, again, building homes, building roads, building communities in very fire-prone areas without following some really great science we have on how to do that in a way that is resilient to the fires that will inevitably happen. So all of that together has built up this tinderbox. But climate change, human-caused climate change, is making things much worse and making it more difficult to take steps to address that and to make things better. And finally, could we ever see fires like that here? Probably not. It is, like you can see from the little graphic, a bit of an apples and orange situation. It's very likely that we will see those changing fire impacts that I mentioned earlier. And those include larger and probably more intense wildfires. We probably won't see those, every year, millions of acres, very large, very intense wildfires that happened in the West. That's pretty unlikely. But we do know that fire management here in North Carolina is already a challenge. It's already a challenge to get the amount of prescribed fire in the landscape that we have, and we need to do more. And everything that is happening, particularly climate change, is going to increase the challenges that we see moving forward. So I'll wrap up with just a couple ways that you can learn more if this is something that you're interested in. Those first two resources, The History of Fire in the Southern United States and Fire in the Eastern US, Influence on Wildlife Habitat. They are academic articles, but they're very, very readable. They are written in plain English, if that's something you're interested in. Dr. Stephen Pine is actually a trained historian. He is, I believe, a professor emeritus or professor, one of those out of Arizona, but his entire work is on the history of fire in the US. One of his books, Fire in America, has a really great section about the South, including North Carolina. And that second link, if you're more of a listener as opposed to a reader, is a lecture he gave called Welcome to the Pyrocene, about sort of the history of fire on the landscape, the history of human use of fire, and how that is sort of leading to this place where we are today, and how that has changed over time. Looking for Longleaf is a great book about the history of the longleaf pine ecosystem and its restoration. 1491 is a great book about the diversity of humans and human civilizations that existed in North and South America pre-Europeans. It's really great, really interesting read. And again, if you're not a reader, The Fire Ties That Bind the Natural and Cultural Heritage of Controlled Burning it was a webinar, but again, it's very plain English, given by a gentleman named Johnny Stowe, who works out of South Carolina, who has a really long history using fire and living on the land through his family, and speaks really compellingly about the meaning of that to him and to his folks, and kind of how that applies to the broader world that we're in today. So that's all I have. I'll take questions if anyone has them. Feel free to email me if you would rather do that. And again, if you have questions about other but slightly related things, of anything about forest management or fire or education about those things, please get in touch and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you've got.
Well, thank you so much, Laurel. That was amazing. Did somebody else unmute? I couldn't hear. Or is that just me reverberating back in my speaker? I did just want to point out, I don't know if folks on this call are local to Lake Johnson Park, but just in terms of getting fire back into the cities, there's an effort to bring prescribed fire back into, well, Lake Johnson Park, like the Raleigh City Parks, and we did do a prescribed fire out at Lake Johnson along the Greenway near Magnolia Cottage last April, and so they hope to do it again in the spring, hopefully, or maybe over the winter, we'll see. But again, it's those burn windows and, making sure that we're doing it at a time that's right environmentally. But it was really interesting when we did it. We had a lot of people for that entire day super concerned that there was, smoke coming out of the forest, that we needed to be, aware of this. And so, yeah, there's doing more fire closer to the city just really gets that education piece out there. People don't, you can tell them day and night, but until they see the smoke, it's important to get fire back closer to the city. So that's something that we're doing here. And I did want to
I'll
ask.
mention too. Sorry, you can go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, can you share the presentation? I would love to get some of those links.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll send this over afterwards.
Yeah, and what were you going to say?
There's a lot of, there's a lot of people in the Raleigh area who are actually already burning. There's a lot of times when I'll talk about this with folks who live in the city, and very understandably, they'll be like, oh, I don't know about that. That sounds kind of scary. And but there's a lot of fire that actually already happens in Wake County and Raleigh. They burn over at Umstead State Park. We burn the Schenck Forest, which is located right next to Umstead. The UNC Botanical Garden burns in the area. Susan mentioned, Raleigh Parks is starting to burn. There's actually quite a bit of fire in the area, and we're trying to do more. And so if you do live near a natural area, maybe get in touch with them and ask them if they burn, because most, like Susan was mentioning, it's a really great public outreach tool. And most places will let people come and watch. And it's, I think, a really great and impactful experience, and really hammers in the fact that we are not just walking around the woods flinging matches out. It really is a well-planned thing. It's usually planned, starting months, if not years in advance. There's a lot of training that goes into it. It's, a very careful implementation, and seeing it in person can kind of really relieve some of the understandable stress that people have when they learn that that's something that's happening near them.
Does anybody else have any questions for Laurel? Well, I love this subject. I'll talk again because I used to work at Tall Timbers, and so when you brought up Stoddard, there are, his fire plots are still there, and we still burn, them according to the plan, according to the research. So that research has been going on for 50 years, and so it's just a really interesting thing to be out there in those plots that, some of them have been burned every year for 50 years, some every other year, every 3 years, there's a certain prescription for each plot. And they're still out there doing that work every year. And so that's just a really neat thing to see. When you're standing there, you can see, between, you can be standing between the plots and see very clearly the difference that just a single year length changes that forest. And I love that you talked about how the early settlers, we know that they looked at the wilderness as something that was scary and dark. And I never put two and two together that the native population was already decimated and was already not continuing that burn regimen that they had been doing, and that those forests were actually growing up. I hadn't connected the dots there, that did happen very quickly. So that was just an interesting thing, I thought. So
yeah.
Anyway,
and I love your point about the Stoddard plots, and it is a really it is a cool thing and a real piece of a thing that is important about the South, that when so many other parts of the country just totally lost any, or not any, but most practical knowledge of how to burn, that we kept that better than a lot of places. And we do have this relatively strong history looking back many decades of places where we can go to and say, okay, they've been using fire on this specific plot, and we have the research carefully documenting it, for 60, 70 years. That it's a really valuable resource, and also a really kind of, to me, very sad reminder of what we've lost with what was done to Native people, because it's really incredible to talk to practitioners who have worked on and managed a site for, their entire career, for 4 or 5 decades. The amount that they know about that place and the amount that they can tell you about how to burn and how the fire will go and the weather that they need without looking at at anything, without looking at a tool, without, just because they know that place and they can tell, is really incredible. And then to think about, there were people who had that ancestral knowledge going back literally thousands of years, is really incredible to think about, and very sad to, have not lost all of that necessarily, but to, have lost at least some of that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'll send you this presentation, and if folks have other questions afterwards, feel free to shoot me an email. I'm happy to chat more.
All right. Well, anybody else have questions? Raise your hand, unmute yourself, just stick it in the chat. All right.
It looks like Sarah is typing, so I don't want to cut her off just in case.
Oh, can you see that?
Oh, she just says, thank you so much. We're good.
All right, well, I'm going to stop the recording. I just want to say, Laurel, thank you again for sharing with us tonight. And for the rest of you, if you are interested, we have a December 14th lecture by Rhonda Sherman on vermicomposting to feed your soil, which will be very interesting. She's local to Lake Johnson Park. She actually lives very close by here and has taught vermicomposting for many years. So it should be a really interesting lecture as well. Let us know if you guys have any questions. And again, thank you so much, Laurel. I'm going to end the recording now.